Hey guys, this is Miss Bellish. I'm so happy to continue reading Frindle with you. This chapter is super fun, so I'm really excited to dig deep. But as always, we wanted to start with our I can statements. So our I can statements are the following. I can use text evidence to support my answers. Y'all, text evidence is super important. We know that it's always important that we have proof whenever we are answering a question, and that text evidence is our proof. It's kind of like if I were an archaeologist, I could tell you all that I'm an archaeologist, but if I held up a dinosaur bone, then it would convince you a lot more deeply that I absolutely am an archaeologist. It would be that proof. So just like in that case, it's always important that we have our proof, that we supply text evidence to support our answers. The next thing that we are all going to be able to do is I can close read a text, and I'm just going to highlight this in red. So close reading a text is super important. We do that by stopping and just really noticing what we are reading. And so together we're going to absolutely be able to close read a text. And then the final I can statement, which we will delve into with a vocabulary preview, is I can determine the meaning of unknown words. So anytime a word is unknown, we're going to be able to figure out that meaning using context clues. So let's go ahead into our vocabulary preview and look through chapter 9 of Frindle. So with the vocabulary preview, I just have a few words highlighted. So here's one. Then, while Nick's parents listened, Mrs. Chatham laid out the story as she saw it, Nick encouraging the other kids to use his new word. So based on that context, what do you think the word encouraging means? So it means to give support, confidence, or hope. So if Nick is encouraging people to use his words, that means he's convincing them, he's supporting them in using Frindle, the word Frindle. Let's look at this one, rebellion. Mrs. Granger forbidding it, the ruined 5th grade class picture, hundreds of kids staying after school, and a general feeling that there was a rebellion at school. With no one respecting the rules anymore. Based on that context, I can tell that a rebellion has to do with people not being respectful. So a rebellion is an act of a violent or open resistance to an established government or ruler. So in this case, that would be open resistance to what the teachers were wanting, an open resistance to Mrs. Granger's want for the students to just use the word pen. We have this other word, it's a lack of respect for authority. So authority is a power. So in the case of the school, the authority would of course be maybe the administration, teachers, the principals, people who have positions of power. And then overreaction means to respond more emotionally or forcibly than justified. We also have this, I mean, it's not like vandalism or stealing or something like that. Based on that context, I know that vandalism is kind of like stealing. So it's something that's bad, something that's illegal. Let's see what it means. So clicking on this word. So vandalism is an action involving deliberate destruction of or damage to public or private property. And we also have this word twilight. Then the Black Queen put on her red scarf and walked off into the October twilight. I also see that someone's saying good night right here, so maybe twilight has to do with it being nighttime. So twilight means the soft glowing light from the sky when the sun is below the horizon. So it's right when the sun goes down. That's when twilight occurs. Okay, so that's our vocabulary preview. Let's go ahead into this chapter. Now, based on the actual name of this chapter, make a prediction. What will this chapter be about? So I'm going to show you guys a picture of chess because that's the name of our chapter. So based on the name of this chapter, let's make a prediction. What do you think this chapter will be about? Okay, awesome job, my friends. So let's begin reading. Mrs. Margaret Chatham had been principal of Lincoln Elementary School for 18 years. She knew Mr. and Mrs. Allen because they had all served together on the building committee when the old Lincoln School was torn down and the new one was built 6 years ago. When she telephoned on the afternoon of October 1st to set up the meeting, Mrs. Chatham had asked Nick to be there too. It was 6:30 when she knocked, and Nick opened the door. "Good evening, Nick," she said. No smile. She's probably kind of upset right now. "Hi, Mrs. Chatham," said Nick, backing away as she filled the doorway. She was a large person, as tall as Nick's dad, with wide shoulders. Nick guessed she would play linebacker on a football team, because that's what his dad had played in college. So this is Mrs. Chatham. How do you think Nick feels based on this picture? The game was not over. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Allen," she said, stepping into the living room. She was wearing a long black raincoat with a red silk scarf tied loosely around her neck. She kept her coat on, but took off the scarf and tucked it into her left pocket. She shook hands stiffly with both of Nick's parents before sitting down on the chair to the left of the couch. Nick's mom and dad sat on the couch, and Nick sat on the rocking chair that faced Mrs. Chatham across the low coffee table. "This is not an easy visit for me. We are having some trouble at school, and it appears that Nick is in the middle of it." Then, while Nick's parents listened, Mrs. Chatham laid out the story as she saw it. Nick encouraging the other kids to use his new word, Mrs. Granger forbidding it, the ruined fifth grade class picture, hundreds of kids staying after school, and a general feeling that there was a rebellion at school, with no one respecting the rules anymore. Nick watched his mom and dad while Mrs. Chatham talked, looking from one face to another. His dad was listening carefully, nodding and frowning. He looked embarrassed about the trouble, but his mom looked kind of annoyed. And when Mrs. Chatham finished her story, Nick's mom was the first one to speak. "But doesn't all this seem like a lot of fuss about something pretty silly?" So based on what Nick's mom just said, she doesn't really understand why Mrs. Chatham, the principal, had to come over to their house just to tell them that Nick was calling a pen a Frindle, and so were a lot of his friends. She says that it's a lot of fuss about something pretty silly. How would your parents react? Make a connection from the text to your own life. How do you think your parents would react if your principal, Dr. Jones, came over to your house and was telling them that you made up a word? How would your parents react to this encounter? Nick sat quietly, but in his mind he shouted, "Hurrah for Mom! Hurrah for mothers everywhere!" His mom wasn't annoyed with him. She was annoyed with Mrs. Granger, maybe even annoyed with Mrs. Chatham. This was getting interesting. Mrs. Allen was still talking to the principal. I mean, is there really any harm in the children making up a funny word and saying it? Does there have to be a rule that a word like this may not be used? Mrs. Chatham sighed and said, "Yes, I suppose it does seem silly. But Mrs. Granger thinks that it's rather like keeping children from saying ain't. There have to be standards. That's why we have dictionaries. And really, the problem isn't so much the word itself. It's a lack of respect for authority. Mr. Allen said, Mrs. Granger's right about that. There have to be standards. We can't have kids walking around saying ain't, can we? And that's when Nick piped in. You know that big dictionary in Mrs. Granger's room? The word ain't is right there in the dictionary, or in the book. I look it up, and there it was. I don't see why I can't use a word if it's in the dictionary. Mrs. Granger even said that her big dictionary was the law. Nick looked from face to face to face. That stumped them all. He had just launched a first-class thought grenade. Well, yes, but, well, as I said, the word ain't and even the word frindle, these are not the real issue here, said Mrs. Chatham. Mrs. Allen said, well, I think the real issue is Mrs. Granger's reaction to a harmless little experiment with language. It's an overreaction. Don't you think so, Tom? And Mrs. Allen looked at her husband. It was Mr. Allen's turn to look from face to face to face. I'm seeing this again and again. All of the adults looking around at each other. He was lost. Yes, well, sure. I guess so. I mean, it's not like anybody's been hurt. It's not like vandalism or stealing or something like that. His sentence trailed off, and he rubbed his chin and stared thoughtfully through the window on the wall behind Mrs. Chatham. And while the three grown-ups sat there in an uncomfortable moment of silence, Nick had a sudden vision of what was really going on here. It was a chess game, Nick against Mrs. Granger. Kind of like the title of the chapter. Mrs. Granger had just tried to end the game by using her queen, Mrs. Chatham, in her black raincoat, the Black Queen. So what is the metaphor? What two elements are being directly compared? I'll give you a hint. Someone is being compared to something. So what is the metaphor? What two elements are being directly compared in the highlighted sentences? Nick didn't know it until the attack was underway, but he had a powerful defender of his own. Good old Mom, the White Queen. And the game was not over. It would go until there was a winner and a loser. Mrs. Chatham didn't stay much longer. There was a little more talk back and forth across the chessboard about how children have a right to explore new ideas and the importance of respecting teachers and the work they do, and everybody needing to keep up standards and make school a safe place to learn. Then Mr. Allen offered Mrs. Chatham some coffee and banana bread, but she said, "No thanks. I really must be going now." She thanked Nick's parents and they thanked her. Nick opened the door and said, "Good night, Mrs. Chatham." Then the Black Queen put on her red scarf and walked off into the October twilight. And that's a reference to how in the pawns there's a Black Queen and there is a white. So you'll see the colors here. So Mrs. Chatham is that Black Queen who put on her red scarf and walked off into the October twilight. "Nick, I think we'd better talk a little more about this," said his mom, sitting back down on the couch. "If I find out that you've been disrespectful to Mrs. Granger or any other teacher at school, then you really will be in big trouble." "I haven't been disrespectful. Honest. I did get everyone started using my word, but like you said, it's not hurting anybody. And I'm sorry if me and Dave and Pete got everybody to ask Mrs. Granger's to borrow a Frindle. That was mean, I guess. But she started it by making kids stay after school and write 100 sentences just for saying my word once. All the kids like to use my word. It's just fun, that's all. Well, said Nick's dad, if it gets everyone upset and makes the principal come talk to your mother and me, then it must not be fun for everybody, is it? And I think you should just tell all your friends to knock it off right now. I mean, tomorrow. Nick shook his head. I can't, Dad. It won't work. It's a real word now. It used to be just mine, but not anymore. If I knew how to stop it, I think I probably would, but I can't. And Nick looked at both of their faces to see if that idea was sinking in. It was. Like I said, I won't be disrespectful, but I do like my word. And I guess now we're just going to have to see what happens. And the chessmen, Nick's king and queen, had to agree. The game would go on. Who are Nick's metaphorical chess king and queen? So there's a metaphor here, comparing the king in chess and the queen in chess to some people. So who are Nick's metaphorical chess king and queen? Okay, my friends, that is the end of the chapter. And I will put in the optimistic closure in the folder for asynchronous work. Thanks, y'all.